This is a review of a Niner Sur 9 that I set up as a single speed. I did another video on my channel where I showed it as it kind of came out of the box and showed some features of it. So this video will continue that and go into more of an in-depth riding review. I've been riding the bike for about 6 weeks now, and so I figured it's time to go ahead and do a review on it. Let me start off this video just by talking about how I got to the single speed. I mentioned in my other video that a few years ago I did own a single speed, but I did not like the chain tensioning device on it, which I'll go into a little bit more as I go over this bike. So typically my stable of bikes has included 3 bikes: a full suspension 29er, which is set up pretty light, that's my race bike. Also a trail / all mountain bike that in the past has been about 150 millimeter travel 26er, but I'm really considering a 650B bike to replace that, and also a cyclocross bike. And so that's been my stable for several years. It's worked really well for me, but I've been saving up some money for a road bike to supplement my training. However, a few months ago I decided against that for a few reasons. One is I really think that road cycling is becoming more dangerous. That's a different topic, but it seems like with the distractions in cars, I hear of more and more accidents with bikes. And so also, since I just love mountain biking and cyclocross, one more ride on a road bike is one less ride on a mountain bike or cross bike. So I decided to use that money to get a single speed, and I went with the Sur 9, and I'll go over a lot of features on it here in a minute. But I think that having a single speed has several benefits. One is it just breaks up my typical local trails and breaks up the riding. It just makes the riding a little bit different. You know, it's a different type of riding, different type of bike handling. Also, just the simplicity of it, lower maintenance. A hardtail single speed is a really low maintenance bike, so I can put in a lot of miles with less maintenance. And also, I think it supplements my training well. You know, having to power up climbs in some sections and having to spin in other sections really adds a little bit different dimension to my training. This bike built up just a hair over 24 pounds. It's got the Stan's Crest wheel set, and it's got some pretty large tires, particularly the front. It's got a 2.4 because I had these Maxxis Ardents laying in the garage and I wanted to use them. When the front wears out, I'll probably put on a 2.25, which is what the rear has. I want to stick with high volume. Being a hardtail, larger volume just makes the ride a little bit more compliant. But building it up as a single speed was really easy because Niner just gets it when it comes to single speeds. You've got the eccentric bottom bracket, which I'll go over in a minute, and you've also got the maxle, the rear maxle, that's got 2 different configurations. One has an end bolt with a derailleur hanger, and the one that's on the bike now without a derailleur hanger for when you run it as a single speed. But if you look at the frame, it really just looks like the frame was meant to be a single speed because there are no bosses on the frame for a rear derailleur cable. What you would do if you're going to run gears on it, it's got cable guides that come with it, which I showed in my other video, but you would put them here. It's got 2 different types of cable guides. One has can run one cable if you want to run a 1x, or if you want to run a rear derailleur and a front derailleur. It's got cable guides that will run 2 cables. And so when you get back here, you would just run the derailleur cable underneath that chainstay protector, which I did include on the bike because I just wanted some extra protection. This bike does come with a headset, which is really nice. And the headset that it comes with, the top bearings are internal, but the bottom bearings are external, which is a little bit different than what you'd see on an aluminum bike or on a carbon bike, because with a steel bike you cannot flange out the head tube as you would on a carbon or aluminum. And so the cups are external so that you can run a 1.5 inch tapered steered tube fork. I had mentioned the Biocentric 2 bottom bracket, and this is different from the Biocentric 1, which only had 1 bolt, which you really had to just torque down. This one has 2 bolts, and you torque it to 12 Newton meters. Now, this the chain stays pretty tight on this bike. It has loosened up a little bit, but this is a new chain, so
it's very minimal, and I think some of that may be chain stretch. Whether or not the biocentric is slipping a little bit, if it is, it's very minor. And it's about over 5-6 hours of riding that I noticed the chain is just a little bit looser. And I did follow Niner's instructions by using pipe joint compound and tighten it to the specs of 12 Newton meters. And the good thing is there is no creaking at all. And if you do have to tighten it, it's very, very simple. All you do is you tighten, or you loosen these bolts, put a 6mm hex wrench in here just to give you some leverage, turn it just a hair, tighten the bolts, you're done. It takes about 2 minutes. Again, it's something that I've done about every 5 or 6 hours of riding. But like I said, some of that may be due to chain stretch. It's not much at all if it is moving. It's definitely not a problem. I had mentioned before that I had another single speed that used, it wasn't sliders, they're actually the whole dropout moved, and you had 2 bolts on each side, and they would not keep tight. And one of the rides I actually slipped so bad the chain broke, whacked my knee on the stem, and that's when I kind of hung it up for that bike. Even though I had tried several different things, I could never get it to stay. Running a single speed with a biocentric is super easy. When you put the rear wheel in, everything stays lined up, and you don't have to keep the center of the rear wheel. It's obviously, when you put the Maxle on, it's perfectly lined up, and so definitely, in my opinion, the way to go for a single speed. For this bike, I went with Niner's new Rdo Seatpost. If you're not familiar with this, this is a post that is carbon and has pretty good amount of flex to it. And all of the past hardtails that I've ridden have used suspension seat posts. Started out with a RockShox telescoping, moved to a Cane Creek Thudbuster, and then I've been on full suspensions for a while. So I like something that's going to be fairly plush, and so this seat post, I wanted to keep things light and simple for the bike, so I didn't want to get a suspension seat post without at least trying this. And this one really works as advertised. You can look down and see the saddle kind of moving around a little bit. I have a pretty decent amount of seat post extending from the frame. It's probably about average, which you kind of need for this post so it can flex back and forth. But it really does a good job of softening the hits. Now obviously for big hits you still got to come out of the saddle as you would on a hardtail. But I'm really liking this post, and I would recommend it. It's a little pricey, but I think it's a really good investment. Now I mentioned before the rear derailleur cable, which I don't have on this bike, being a single speed, of course. But the rear brake cable really runs nicely along the frame. You've got bosses in the right places. You've got 2 down here. And then you've got the brake caliper that is tucked in between the seat stay and chain stay. And functionally, I think the main thing that it does is it keeps it protected. The only challenge is when you bleed the brakes, because of the position of the banjo bolt there, you have to drop the caliper off the bike and let it hang down. But typically bleeding is something you do just at setup, and it's over with, so that's not a big deal. The only downside to this is if you want to run a larger rotor. I've got a 160, which usually is what you'd run on this kind of bike. If you wanted to run something bigger, I don't know if you can fit a 180 in there, but I do know you couldn't fit anything bigger than a 180. One thing that's really cool about this bike is the flexibility of running it single speed, 1x10 or 11 or whatever you would do, or putting a front derailleur on it as well. This is the boss for the front derailleur. I mentioned the cable guides that you would run under there, and then you just run it as a bottom pull front derailleur. But if you wanted to have a single speed and then convert it to a 1x10,
This is a bike that you could really do that easily, especially running a full-length cable housing. You could have the derailleur and the shifter kind of together, and then you would just put on a cassette, put on the rear derailleur and the shifter, and probably within about 15 minutes switch it back and forth between a single speed and a geared bike, because I do not have a single speed specific hub. I have a typical hub, got spacers, and put a cog on. I'm running a Surly cog. Again, very flexible in the fact that you can run different gearing options on the bike. Let me talk about the frame and the ride characteristics. First of all, I'll say that I went with a small size frame. I am 5'8", and the small fits me perfectly. Most of the Niners that I've ridden in the past have been smalls. I did have a Jet 9 Rdo that was a medium, just because the top tubes seem a little bit smaller on those. But this small fits me really well. Alright, so this is a Reynolds 853 steel bike, and that's a high-end steel, and you don't see a lot of steel bikes these days, but I'm really glad Niner continues to produce these, because steel has so many positive ride characteristics. It absorbs bumps really well. It's not as expensive as carbon. The only downside to steel is that it is heavier than a carbon bike or aluminum bike would be. But it's a much nicer ride than aluminum. And I used to own a Niner Air 9 Carbon, and I really like the feel of the steel on the trail better than that bike. Even though the carbon was obviously very stiff laterally, it was also, I feel, a little bit harsher than the steel bike. This bike is really responsive in the corners. The geometry on this bike is really, really nice. It's not too twitchy, but yet this is probably one of the best handling 29ers that I've ever ridden. Niner really has their geometry dialed down nicely, and it shows in this bike. You can see that the seat stays have a little bit of a wishbone, which probably gives it a little bit of bump absorption, but yet still keeping the bike laterally stiff. Obviously, with the 1.5 head tube and also the rear axle, that's going to give the bike some really good lateral stiffness. I'm not really heavy. I'm only 145 pounds, so I'm not going to flex a bike as much as someone who is heavier. But I don't feel any flex on this bike. When I go into a corner, I don't feel like there's any wandering. I feel like the bike really cuts into the corners, holds its line really well, and does a really good job on the really tight sections of trail. So that's it for the review of the Niner Sur 9 built up as a single speed. Hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll close this out with a little bit of riding footage. This footage will also give you an idea of the really tight trails that we have here in north central Florida. So you'll be able to see some of the handling characteristics of the bike as I ride. And it was a little chilly when I did the video, so please excuse the fluorescent green vest in the video. But I hope you enjoyed it, and ride safe.